And welcome to Doubts Welcome, a ministry dedicated to answering your doubts, questions, and concerns about the Bible, God, and Christianity. As you can see, today we're continuing our Bible study series in the Gospel according to John, looking at John chapter 2, verses 12 to 25. Now, this is a rather large chunk of text, and after I started doing my study, I realized just how much information is in this chunk of text, so I decided to break it up into 3 videos. In this first video, we're going to look at family and Passover. In the next video, we're going to look at the cleansing of the temple. And in the third video, we're going to look at the prophecy of death and resurrection that Jesus gives later in the passage. In our previous video, we talked about the wedding of Cana and the subsequent turning of water into wine. If you haven't seen that video, that's fine, but I would suggest going back and watching it because, as I said before, context is king when it comes to biblical interpretation. With that in mind, let's go ahead and jump into our passage for today. After this, he went down to Capernaum, together with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they stayed there only a few days. The Jewish Passover was near, so Jesus went up to Jerusalem. The after this refers to the wedding that I was just talking about. Down to Capernaum makes sense because Capernaum was at a lower elevation than Cana was. As you can see, Cana is here in the middle of the map as it is circled, and Capernaum is up near the northern edge of the Sea of Galilee. So some people might say, oh, they went up to Capernaum. Well, no, they went down, much like someone up in the mountains of Colorado might say that they're going down to Denver. But now what about the family? Well, we're told that his mother, his brothers, and his disciples went with him. The mother and disciples are pretty easy to point out. You have Mary, the mother of Jesus, and then the disciples. It makes the most sense that they're the disciples that were called in chapter 1. Maybe you could argue that another 1 or 2 were added at this time, but based off the text itself, that's all we know about are those disciples that were called. So it makes sense that they were the ones who went with him. What about the brothers? You may be wondering, why does it matter? He had brothers, so what? Well, the Catholics for sure, and possibly some others in the Protestant section that are more closely to Catholicism than, say, some of us other Protestants are, they tend to believe that Mary was a perpetual virgin, meaning she didn't have sexual relations with Joseph after Jesus was born, and therefore could not possibly have had children. However, a lot of Protestants believe that her and Joseph did have other children after Jesus was born, not only boys, but girls as well. There are sisters of Jesus that are mentioned in the New Testament. But because of that, we have to talk a little bit about who these brothers were. All sides, I believe, at least, would agree that Matthew chapter 13, verse 55, gives us the names of these individuals who are called brothers of Jesus. They are James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. Not Iscariot, just so we're clear. James was the leader of the council in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15, and he also wrote the book of James later in the New Testament, so he's kind of a big deal. But although we would agree on the names, we don't, like I said, agree on just what kind of relation to Jesus they actually had. So, moving on to that, there are 3 church fathers who are connected to 3 different positions on this issue. Of course, they aren't the only ones who held these positions, but they're the main ones. We have Helvidius, Epiphanius, and Jerome. Helvidius believed that these are sons of Mary and Joseph after Jesus. And remember, they had daughters as well. Jesus had some sisters. According to Epiphanius, these are sons of Joseph from a prior marriage, and I would have to assume that the sisters would also be from a prior marriage as well. Jerome says they're cousins. Maybe they were on Mary's side or Joseph's side, we're not sure. Now, of course, technically, even if Mary and Joseph had children, they would still be half-brothers and sisters of Jesus because Jesus only has the DNA of Mary, not Joseph. Now, the sisters of Jesus were more than likely old enough to be married at this time, and they would have been with their husbands because of that, so they probably weren't traveling around with their mother and their brothers. So, which of these 3 positions is the correct one? Well, because the Greek term doesn't actually mean cousin, and because there is another word for cousin that is used in the New Testament, I don't believe cousins is an appropriate designation here, so I'm going to take that one off the table. No offense to Jerome and those who followed him, of course. These 2, without looking at other textual considerations, would seem to be equally valid in my opinion. Now, of course, if you're going off of Catholic Church tradition, then it's the second one. But if you look at the biblical text, I believe we have some good supporting evidence for the first one. First we have Luke chapter 2 verse 7, and then we have Matthew chapter 1 verse 25. In Luke 2:7, we're told that Jesus was the firstborn of Mary, not the only child or the only born of Mary. And in Matthew 1:25, we're told that Joseph did not know Mary intimately until after she gave birth to Jesus. If he didn't know her until she gave birth to Jesus, that would intimate that afterwards he did know her intimately, and that is, have sexual relations with her. So both of these, I believe, point towards Mary not being a perpetual virgin, and I don't think there's any reason for her to be a perpetual virgin. Now, just so I'm clear, I don't want to upset anybody. I'm not trying to denigrate or degrade Mary or her image or anything like that. At the same time, she is not nearly as important a player in this as Jesus is, and it is his moral perfection and lack of original sin and things like that that are important. I'm more than willing to discuss Mary and the various doctrines of Mary that the Catholic Church holds. If that's something you want me to do, send me an email, but currently I don't have any plans to do so. Now, one of my commentaries did say they believed that Mary and the brothers were following Jesus around so they could learn from him. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. We do know later that his brothers did not believe in him, until after the resurrection at least, so I don't know why they would go around listening to him preach and teach, but it's possible, I suppose. And of course, if he did miracles similar to the one he did at Cana or with the feeding of the 4,000 and 5,000, then maybe that was why they followed. Kind of like the thousands followed him for a while because of that as well. Moving on, though, let's take a look at the Passover in Jerusalem. Now, looking at the map, you can see Jerusalem here kind of towards the center. It is, of course, the capital of Israel. It's where the temple is. It's kind of a big deal. Passover is also kind of a big deal. Now, if you're new to Christianity, if you've never heard of either Judaism or Christianity, then you may not know what Passover is. If you haven't really looked into the Old Testament at all, even if you are a Christian, then you may not know what it is either, other than having it mentioned in the New Testament a few times. Well, Passover is a celebration and commemoration and a meal. It is celebrating and commemorating the Exodus event. That is, the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, and Pharaoh would not let them go. God sent Moses and told him to tell Pharaoh to let them go. Then he sent the plagues, and then Pharaoh finally let them go, and they traveled on to the Promised Land. That is the Exodus event in a nutshell. There's obviously a lot more to it, but just to keep it short. Now, the meal we have kind of outlined a little bit in Exodus chapter 12. If you want me to do a video on that, let me know. I'd be happy to do so. Just send me an email. The Passover was also connected to the Festival of Unleavened Bread, which is one of 3 festivals where all the Jewish males were to come before Yahweh in Jerusalem, the other 2 being the Festival of Weeks and the Festival of Tabernacles, which is also called the Festival of Booths. And we can find all this in Deuteronomy 16:16. Now, there are at least 3 Passovers mentioned in the Gospel according to John. You can find them here in chapter 2, verses 13 and 23, as well as chapter 6, verse 4, and chapter 11, verse 55. That particular Passover is mentioned over and over again, as you can see with my other references here. But all those references are pointing to that 3rd Passover. There is a possible 4th Passover in chapter 5, verse 1. It's called a Jewish festival, so there's really no way to know whether or not it was a Passover. Could be that John wanted to talk about 3 Passovers as Passovers for some theological reason, but we just can't really know for sure. It is interesting to note as well that Jesus' ministry is kind of bookended by these Passovers. You have his baptism, the miracle at Cana, and then a Passover. And then at the end, you have the Passover at which Jesus is crucified, and then you have him rising from the dead a few days later, another miracle. Theologically important, I think so, but I don't have any deeper insight than that at the moment. Anyway, because of these 3 Passovers, possibly 4, most scholars would say that Jesus' ministry lasted somewhere from 2 to 3 years. However, just because other Passovers aren't mentioned, it doesn't mean that they didn't happen. So it's possible that Jesus' ministry was longer than that, and I could point to the other Gospels that only mention 1 Passover, the one at which Jesus died, to show that if by their reckoning these are 3 separate Passovers in John, then the other Gospels didn't mention those other 2 Passovers. Also, one of the commentaries I was reading said that the Gospel according to John might be a collection of the homilies of John, a homily being a fancy word for sermon, in which case the 3 Passovers and any chronological conclusions based off them would be invalid. Now again, I believe Jesus' life and ministry were longer than people typically think. If you want to know why I think that, send me an email and I'll get to work on a video about that. It would be a pretty short video because I don't have a whole lot to go off of, but it's still something interesting to talk about. With that though, that is the end of this part of the video. Don't forget, in the next one we're going to look at the cleansing of the temple, so please stick around for that one. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up and leave me a comment down below letting me know what you liked or even what you didn't like, things I can do to get better. If you think it'd be useful for your family, friends, or church group, please share it with them in any way that you can. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe and hit that bell notification icon so you know when I post a new video. Don't forget to send me questions on anything and everything relating to the Bible, God, and Christianity. And as always, till next time, bring on the doubts, because you are always welcomed.